Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, running its program on Central Asia. Very warm welcome to our event, the Taliban Takeover and Central Asian Security, the New Reality on the Ground, co-organized by the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The withdrawal of US forces and the speedy collapse of the Afghan government have introduced a drastically new reality on the ground. Central Asian states are facing new challenges and risks. They have to make fast decisions on refugees, border security, international assistance, security alliances, arrangements, taking political positions on the situation in Afghanistan, etc. Security is the primary concern for Central Asian states. They are afraid of the instability, spillovers. And today we gathered an excellent group of experts whom I'm about to introduce to discuss the ongoing dramatic developments and the implications of the new situation on Central Asian security. And I will moderate it together with my wonderful colleague, Mohammed Tahir, Media Relations Manager and host of the Majlis and AFPAC File podcasts at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Let me introduce our speakers. The first will be Omid Marzban, who is a senior multimedia editor at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Afghan service, Radio Azadi. Omid joined Radio Azadi in 2005, and in 2019, he served as Radio Azadi's acting bureau chief in Kabul. Welcome, Omid. Our second speaker is Salimjon Aioubov, who is the director of the Tajik service of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Prior to joining the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, he worked for numerous Tajik print, radio, and television outlets over the course of 2 decades, covering the civil war in Tajikistan and UN-mediated inter-Tajik peace talks and refugee issues resulting from the war. Welcome, Salimjon. Our next speaker is Jennifer Britt Murtazashvili, who is director of the Center for Governance and Markets and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on issues of self-governance, security, political economy, and public sector reform in the developing world. She's the author of multiple publications, but let me mention 2 books that Jennifer published. One is Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan, published by Cambridge University Press, and also the forthcoming book, Land, the State and War, Property Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan, which is also coming from Cambridge University Press. We're very happy to have with you, Jen. Have you with us. And last but not least, we have Stephen Blank, who is Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He has published over 1,500 articles, studies, and books on Soviet, Russian, US, Asian, and European military and foreign policies, testified frequently before the Congress on Russia, China, and Central Asia, consulted for the Central Intelligence Agency, major think tanks, and foundations, and has been a commentator on foreign affairs in the media in the US and abroad. Welcome, Stephen. So without further ado, let me first go to you, Omid. So what are the ongoing developments in Afghanistan, in Panjshir province, northern Afghanistan, that are relevant for Central Asian security? Oh, you need to unmute.
I hope you can hear me now. Hello to everybody, to some members, good morning, to some members, good afternoon. The latest we have from Panjshir is that is the story of about half an hour ago when we spoke to the spokesperson of the alliance there, Mr. Fahmy Dashti. He told us that the negotiations has stopped. Apparently that's a bad sign, that there could be end of the negotiations, and there is a high probability that there will be severe clashes. We have had reports of light clashes yesterday around Parwan and Panjshir provinces. But the Taliban told us that it was the spokesperson for the Taliban told us that it was slight clashes and there haven't been so many casualties. However, the alliance in Panjshir, led by Ahmad Massoud, son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, posted some videos online that they have captured some Taliban fighters, but these were not confirmed by the Taliban. Meanwhile, the Taliban at the moment seems to be in full control of the bordering areas of northern Afghanistan to Central Asia, the topic of the issue we're talking about now. Some people from Kunduz city, where I was born, spoke with me yesterday, telling me that they wanted to cross the border to Tajikistan, fleeing the Taliban, but there's no way because the Taliban won't allow them to get closer to the border. The same issue is around Mazar-e-Sharif, like Balkh province. So far, what we receive is all the borders are closed, and close to the border crossings, it's the Taliban who lead everything, who are in control. There were some reports that some Afghans could cross the border to Iran, based on their personal contacts and personal and high-ranking people they knew in the past, like Ismail Khan, for example. And the only border that's still open and people could commute was said to be Chaman with Pakistan.
Okay, thank you very much. Salimjon, what is happening on our side of the border? What are the concerns, fears, calculations, of Central Asian governments? So what can we discern from what the Tajik government, Uzbek government say, not say, do, not do?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So as Nargis correctly pointed out, the main concern in the Central Asian countries against the backdrop of the events in Afghanistan is related to provision of security and the influx of refugees. Security is number one concern, no matter how each of these countries reacted to the new reality in the region. We have been witnessing different reactions along with some similarities. Those differences and common policies depend on many different factors, such as the geographic proximity and engagement with Afghanistan, the level of ties with the Taliban, the amplitude of attempts to develop a common position, the nature of the regimes themselves, the role and weight of major geopolitical players, and many, many other factors. But whatever it is, security that is the biggest issue. Looking at the news feed of my colleagues from different language departments at RFURL, especially the Central Asian ones, we can see that each of the Central Asian countries has been developing its own way of dealing with the really new situation. Uzbekistan is turning out to be among them most prepared for the current situation. It had established ties with the dialogue with Taliban 2 years ago, and the results, as the Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev noted, a promise from the Taliban that not a single bullet would fly towards Uzbekistan. Yesterday, Uzbekistan celebrated 30th anniversary of independence, and Mr. Mirziyoyev again touched the Afghan problem, expressed confidence that Afghanistan can serve as a bridge between Central and South Asia. He explained the policy by a desire for peace and tranquility for his people, and made a promise that for this he will conduct a dialogue with anyone. The desire of the Uzbek leader intertwined, of course, with economic interests. Also, Uzbekistan, as we know, has many large projects in Afghanistan, such as railway and power line construction, and Uzbekistan exports a good amount of electricity to Afghanistan. However, Tajikistan also exports a comparable amount of electricity to Afghanistan, opened several new bridges, expanded export and import through Afghanistan, inaugurated larger CASA 1000 project together with Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan about exporting electricity to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even to India. And on August 25th, the Tajik president Emomali Rahmon said that his country will not recognize the Taliban government unless there is decent, he says, representation of ethnic Tajiks and other minorities. He also pointed out that Tajiks in Afghanistan make up 46% of the population. By the way, Tajikistan was and is the only one among the Central Asian countries who did not negotiate with the Taliban. And during the previous tenure of Taliban, previous Taliban rule, supported the Northern Alliance, which was opposed to the Taliban. Today, Mr. Rahman awarded two leaders of the former Northern Alliance, Burhanuddin Rabbani, the former president of Afghanistan, and Ahmad Shah Massoud, the former Minister of Defense. In the Rabbani's government, the Ismail Somoni Order of Tajikistan, one of the highest state award. This could be interpreted as Tajikistan's support for the current anti-Taliban resistance movement in the Panjshir Valley. On the contrary, Uzbekistan is not demonstrating any support of the ethnic Uzbeks in Afghanistan, while Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan expressed their readiness to accept ethnic Kyrgyz and Kazakhs. Turkmenistan, the third country bordering Afghanistan, has more contacts with the Taliban than Uzbekistan. But as we know, most of those contacts kept in secret. And the last one was even days before returning Taliban leaders from Doha to Afghanistan for celebrating the victory and forming a new government. In spite of that, even Turkmenistan in early July transferred a big number of troops to the border with Afghanistan. All of those countries, no matter what they are saying or doing, all of them are very concerned about security and about Afghan spillover into Central Asia. Of course, Taliban have pledged not to pose any security threat to those countries, but some of Central Asian countries have had bitter experience during the previous Taliban rule. We can remember that in 1999, under the first Taliban government, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, IMU, IMU's fighters infiltrated through Tajikistan into Kyrgyzstan and demanded a corridor to Uzbekistan, creating a huge security gap, security crisis, and a lot of several terrorist attacks carried out by them and by other groups in Bishkek and Osh and Kyrgyzstan in 2002 and 2003. In 2014, Uzbek security authorities find out that IMU had joined the Islamic State, Khorasan, And and Tajikistan has other groups that afraid of. At the end of July, my colleagues at the radio also, they learned that the protection of the Afghan border posts on the border with Tajikistan in 5 districts, approximately 2/3 of the whole border of 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles was entrusted to the militants of Jamaat Ansarullah or Ansarullah, a group band in Tajikistan formed long ago by those field commanders of the civil war in Tajikistan who did not accept the peace agreement with the government of Imam Ali Rahman. And in the past, a video was posted on social media showing that Ansarullah leaders swearing bayat to Al-Qaeda. However, according to our sources, they were sent in 2019 by Haqqani Network, whose head is the deputy leader of the Taliban movement. The group has estimated 200 to 500 members, and what we know, they are actively trying to recruit more people, more young people from Tajikistan. And actually, Ansarullah is the group which carried out the first ever suicide bombing in Tajikistan on September 3rd, 2010, in the most peaceful city of Khujand in the north, close to the Uzbek border. And 3 police officers were killed and more than 30 of them wounded. So the leader of the group is Amreddin Tabarov. As I said, he didn't accept the peace agreement with the government and moved to Afghanistan. And he was killed actually in 2016 by American forces near Bagram, when he was fighting side by side with Taliban. But now his son-in-law, Muhammad Sharipov, or his militant name is Mahdi Arsalan, is ruling, is commanding this group. He was recruited in Russia, being there as a labor migrant. And the majority of the Ansarullah came from the poorest region of Tajikistan. Actually, Mahdi Arsalan was the one who installed Taliban flag on July 26 on the Tajik-Afghan border post. And maybe many of you knew about 2 high-profile, deadly attacks happened in Tajikistan, one on a group of foreign cyclists on July 29, 2018, and the second one on Tajik border post on November 2019, and believe that they relate to the Islamic State, because the Islamic State, the extremist group, claimed responsibility for both. Though there are some doubts of other local groups' involvement. As we remember, Tajik authorities said the attackers were trained abroad, but accused banned Islamic Renaissance Party of being behind the attack on the cyclists without offering credible proof of the claim. And another big news was disappearance of a former Special Forces commander, Gulmurod Halimov, trained in Russia and the United States, who moved to Syria to join ISIS in 2015. It was a huge embarrassment for Tajikistan, but a huge inspiration for the extremist groups. and there were reports that he was killed in Syria, either in Syria, in Raqqa, or in Iraq. However, today we are hearing some rumors that maybe he is in Afghanistan. But anyway, so a lot of names of those groups, Jabhat al-Nusra, Jundul Khalifa, and so on and so on. But for the ordinary citizen in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, and other parts of Central Asia, it's not a matter what the name, the title of those groups, and what the ideological differences between them, like being Salafi or Devbandi or Wahhabi or whatever. They afraid that those type of attacks will increase because of second Taliban rule. And because this is the ideology that, and talking to us, many of fellow citizens say that the ultimate goal of all these groups is single, is one. They call secular states as toguts, from the Arabic verb togu, which means disobedience, non-compliance, and rebellion against Allah. And toguts, they call presidents toguts as patrons or helpers of unbelievers, of infidels, and so on. And just recently, we talked to a very one of the best political scientists in Tajikistan, Parviz Mullajanov, who said that Taliban will not ban or dismiss or destroy these groups who helped them to come to power, but probably they will ask them to act cautiously, calmly, or covertly. And for the time being, maybe they will increase their activities in terms of recruitment, training, inspirations, and in the future, in the long term, there will be problems in the country, and this problem is intertwined with the refugees problem, because as maybe you heard that even Russian President Vladimir Putin criticized the West's ideas on the placement of refugees from Afghanistan in the Central Asian countries, arguing that among them there may be radicals who will then by cars or by donkeys arrive in Russia and create a crisis there. At the time being, most part of the Uzbek, Turkmen, and Tajik border with Afghanistan are closed, and all those countries are reluctant to accept refugees unless for short stay, for the transferring to the third countries. However, among them, maybe Tajikistan is doing a little better for the refugees, accepting them. We know that already more than 1,000 refugees are in Tajikistan, and the government is ready to allow them to stay. But in other countries, just yesterday, there was a report that Uzbekistan is turning back a lot of refugees, and also threatening not threatening, but I have to say, told the US that if the 650 pilots, military pilots of Ashraf Ghani's government who arrived in Uzbekistan on planes, if they will not be transferred to the third countries, so Uzbekistan will decide to send them back to Afghanistan. And last point about Turkmenistan, also in a meeting, in a conversation with the EU president, the Turkmen president Berdi Muhammadov said that he will not accept Afghan refugees because of not helping spreading of COVID-19. Although Mr. Berdi Muhammadov, since the beginning of the pandemic, has been saying that there is no COVID-19 in Turkmenistan at all. So this type of situation, but if just one last sentence about little global view, that we are witnessing a lot of military drills in the region. Russia is very active, holding a month-long military exercise in Tajikistan, reinforcing its largest base there. We are hearing a lot of calls from Russian politicians that Uzbekistan should join the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. Otherwise, so if Uzbekistan will join, so Russia will help and things like this. Even 2 weeks ago, Chinese special forces participated a joint exercise in Tajikistan in Dushanbe suburb. Some experts believe that Russia and China, possibly even Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and India will likely see a demand from the Central Asian countries for the security assistance that will be accompanied by the maintenance of their influence in the region. Others envision the hardening of the existing autocratic regimes on the banner of national consolidation, nationalism, and so on, in the face of threats with all the ensuing consequences, particularly about political freedom, about human rights and freedom of speech, and all those type of things. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salimjon. You covered a lot of ground and definitely I've drawn a very complex picture for us. Just to confirm, would it be accurate to say that that Tajikistan's current position is to make a bet on the anti-Taliban resistance and seal the border in the meantime? And Uzbekistan kind of counts on this arrangement with the Taliban, and also seals the border, but wants to do these projects, economic projects with Afghanistan, and
even supporting
kind of one word. Is it accurate or not?
Yeah, it's accurate. Even supporting the anti-Taliban resistance, Tajikistan is thinking about own security. Thinking that if there will be someone just being there in the middle, maybe it will increase some security options.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I hope in the discussion we'll discuss the kind of the position of Russia, the differences between the position of Central Asian countries and Russia. Jen, to you, you study both Afghanistan and Central Asia. Can you shed some light for us on the linkages between them, and what shall we take into account to kind of look into carefully to understand the implications of the developments in Afghanistan on Central Asia?
So thank you, Nargis, and thanks for having me, such an esteemed group of panelists. And I should say that I'm here for Suzanne Levy-Sanchez, who couldn't make it. And I'd encourage all of you to read her new book that's coming out on the Afghan-Tajik border. And she's got a lot of insights. So she's another person to look to on these questions. So this is a really interesting time in terms of foreign policy issues in Central Asia, Central Eurasia. I think many of the Central Asian states initially feared these refugee flows coming in from Afghanistan into Central Asia, but we saw very quickly that didn't happen. And I was very skeptical of those claims just because Afghans have been migrating for decades and decades, and Central Asia has never been a destination for them. And it was always very clear that those borders would remain shut to the extent that those governments could control those borders, especially Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I think that is sort of the major humanitarian crisis that many people look to in the beginning. We didn't see that happen. It'll be interesting to see, Uzbekistan has pledged to be a hub for humanitarian aid going forward. We're still not sure about humanitarian aid. It looks, that the government in Kabul is quite weak right now. The Taliban have taken control, but it's not sure that, entirely clear how they will govern. They're going to be announcing a government this week, but currency reserves are frozen. People can't access money from their bank accounts. So it's a pretty dire situation financially. Government officials haven't been paid. And so this actually feeds into a kind of humanitarian crisis. And you couple that with the drought that's taken place in the region, and things are not looking good in Afghanistan. Although on the other hand, with the exception of Panjshir and these areas around that, Afghanistan is experiencing a lull in fighting for the time being. We're not seeing the wide-scale fighting that Afghanistan has witnessed for the past 30 years. Not that Taliban rule is the answer, the solution, but in terms of feeding into humanitarian crisis, at least it's something positive that people have right now. But it remains to be seen. I think once the Taliban decide how they're going to govern, and people are sort of sorting this out right now, then we're going to see how they'll use coercion, whether they're willing to accommodate different forces. As Omid mentioned, there's the talks between Ahmed Massoud and the Taliban have broken down. It doesn't seem that, at least for now, that the Taliban are willing to accommodate Massoud's desires, in terms of power sharing and decentralization and many things that he's called for. And it's interesting that the president of Tajikistan has actually, reinforced those claims. And I want to say something really interesting about, not really interesting about Tajikistan, but something I found very interesting about what's going on in Tajikistan right now is their foreign policy towards Afghanistan. And I think that you recall this summer, there was a border conflict between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in the Fergana Valley. And at that time, we saw a lot of nationalism. It was the first interstate conflict between two states in Central Asia, and it unleashed a lot of nationalism. It was always there, but we saw it. I saw it in social media in ways that I hadn't seen in a very long time, or even before. And so I would really, a question for Salimjon as we go forward is Tajikistan's policy towards Afghanistan, this sort of continuation, this discussion of Tajik nationalism, the role of Ahmed Shah Massoud, Rabbani. He's been talking about these political figures for the past 6 or 7 months in ways that I can't recall him speaking about in the past decade. So we're seeing sort of this resurgence in the discussion of Tajik nationalism, Tajiks across borders, and that is sort of breaking a taboo for Central Asian countries who normally don't speak about ethnic minorities across borders. It's been one of those informal rules that has kept at least stability between countries where there are many minorities living across borders. In terms of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, I think, across these countries, you have landlocked countries dealing with landlocked countries. And so the relations between them is very, very important, more so than probably any other place in the world, because they're so dependent on one another economically. And we can see that Mirziyoyev has embarked on a new domestic policy, which has an intrinsic foreign policy tied to it. So you recall that Islam Karimov was very inward-looking, autarkic. Mirziyoyev's economic model is outward-looking, based on trade, jobs creation, and so forth. So his entire foreign policy is based on good relations with neighbors, opening up ties, access to trade, commerce. And so Afghanistan actually hasn't been very different in this regard, but it meant a complete reversal of Uzbekistan's policy towards Afghanistan. And it's been quite interesting to see how Karimov really hedged his bets. Mirziyoyev hedged his bets with regard to Afghanistan, because you could see for the past 2 years, there was a real sense in Tashkent, I think, that the Ghani government was sort of on its last legs. It didn't have a lot of legitimacy. The US intervention there wasn't working. And I think this is something that, for those Americans or others who are just paying attention to the region for the first time, the North in particular have been quite decimated by this conflict since 2013, 2014. 30% of the population in the North has been displaced since that time. So there's mass migration. growing instability. So I think that's something to bear in mind. So Uzbekistan looked to the Taliban as an opportunity to engage, to promote its own internal economic strategy. I think there's some hope from Tashkent right now that someone called me yesterday from Uzbekistan and said, I think the Uzbek government's hoping for sort of a Ramazan Kadyrov solution, that the Taliban can impose order and there can be prosperity because they're tired of the instability. I'm not sure that the Taliban can impose that kind of order just because Afghanistan is so diverse. And we know from Afghan history that one group tries to impose its rule on others, then it's a recipe for disaster. And we've seen this time and time again because of the country's ethnic, geographic, all the diversity that Afghanistan possesses. So if the Taliban are willing, I hate the word moderate, but if they're willing to accept some kind of power sharing, I think it'll lower the costs to coercion, and there might be more of an opportunity to engage in a kind of economic trade. But if they do engage in this coercive path, I think they're going to face a lot of resistance. And so I think what we're seeing from the north, from Panjshir, I'm not sure how successful Masoud is being right now. Tajikistan is really the only group, only country that's come out and supported them. It's unclear what Russia is doing, and it's unclear what kind of material support is being provided to Masoud right now. So it seems like a pretty lonely endeavor, although I just saw a district in Bavlan fell just a few minutes before our discussion today. So I'd be curious, Omid, what your thoughts are on that. But it doesn't look good for this insurgency. But another thing I'm hearing from friends inside of Afghanistan is that the anti-Taliban resistance, if as the northern groups, the historic Northern Alliance groups have weakened over time, ISIS becomes a much more attractive source of opposition to the government for ethnic minorities. And we don't want to exaggerate this, right? So a couple of things can be true. It can be true that countries in Central Asia use the threat of ISIS to repress their own populations. And it can also be true that ISIS does exist in Afghanistan and does pose a threat in some way to Central Asia. So if these ethnic minorities look to ISIS as a more solid form of opposition to the Taliban, then I think that there's opportunities for Central Asians to engage with the Taliban, with these groups in northern Afghanistan, and we're beginning to see bits and pieces of this, from some of the attacks that we saw in the north in northern Afghanistan over the past 6 months. And these are newer groups, younger groups who've come over, and they seem quite separate from the traditional Ansarullah groups that have been there for some time. But once again, it's really hard to say because we don't know about them. So a lot of this really remains quite speculative. But I think that's something that we should certainly look out for without, getting dramatic about it and exaggerating it. But we have to look at what would be the source of opposition to a Taliban government, because the Taliban have been fighting these groups. We're seeing increased radicalization, I think, in northern Afghanistan. Over the past 6 or 7 years, there was deep disillusionment with the Ghani government. And so people were looking for something else. They weren't happy with the Taliban. That's something to look out for. But there's opportunities right now, I think, that we haven't seen in many years. With the withdrawal of the United States, there's obviously an opportunity for sort of a regional, I wouldn't call it realignment, but local, the countries in the region have a much more important role to play than they ever had in the past 20 years. And it's very interesting to watch. I think we're seeing some very creative things happening. And it's really interesting to see. I'll be watching how these different strategies in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, sort of vis-a-vis Afghanistan, play out. Will that lead to tensions between the two? Or is Tajikistan, making these, what role does Russia have in all of this? I know Professor Blank will speak about that in a second. Is Russia using Tajikistan to sort of hedge its own bets? It's got Rahman on one side saying nice things about Ahmed Masoud and the resistance, and Uzbekistan on the other really aligned with the Taliban. So there's lots of questions, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out, and just really hopeful that this could be some kind of opportunity for power sharing in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Jen. A lot of excellent points and questions that we will, I hope we will address in the Q&A session. So it seems that mentally for the Uzbek government, Afghanistan remains an important corridor. Yeah. But let's imagine that Taliban, they manage to consolidate control and so on and so forth, and like make arrangements with the domestic actors, with external actors. Can they do these projects? You wrote yourself about the kind of the government appointments. They don't seem very promising. They don't appoint like experts, specialists, people who know things to these positions. And I don't think investors will be in a rush to come back to Afghanistan. Like what will the World Bank do? And even Chinese investors, I don't think they will be, kind of in a hurry. So how justified is this Uzbek vision, you think?
So these are really good questions. And I think that, Uzbekistan has never been one to rely on what the international community is saying or doing, right? So they've always paved their own path in this direction. And I think my sense is that their attitude is that, look, this is our neighbor. The neighbor's not going anywhere. We've tried isolating them in the past. Remember, Karimov wouldn't have anything to do with this. But there was a regional summit. It was last month or 2 months ago in Tashkent, and Uzbekistan signed a strategic partnership with Pakistan. And when I saw that partnership was signed, to me, the writing was on the wall that their relationship with Ghani, Ghani was never happy with Uzbekistan. They were never happy with what Tashkent was doing in Afghanistan. So to me, they were happy. I'm not happy that the Taliban took over, but I think relieved that at least there was a belief, I think, by some in Tashkent that the Taliban have more control over the regions they govern than the Afghan government does. At least like when the Taliban give their word to do something, they'll do it. They may be less fragmented than the Afghan state. So it really depends on where Afghanistan goes here. So do they take an Iranian model? Right? I mean, a lot of people are talking about that. If they do, I think this is much more foreseeable. It really, really depends on, I know it sounds crazy but I don't think Afghanistan is going to be isolated the way it was. I think they have real choices to make, but economically the country is far more dependent on outsiders than it was 20 years ago. That's what's changed. The population has changed. It can't govern the same way that it did, or if it did, it would incur enormous costs. It would be very costly to that government, and you wouldn't be talking about economic development strategies. You'd be talking about something like North Korea, right? Because they would have to use that level of repression. So I don't think that they're going to be able to do that because they're so dependent on outsiders for assistance and for survival. And the longer this economic crisis goes on, the more people are less willing to support them. There is some goodwill. They've brought in some people, the former finance minister under Karzai, Zakhilwal, has come back. They've been able to attract some of these people to come back and say, no, we're going to run things, we're going to try. I do know people who have stayed behind. Not everyone has left. So I think we're seeing things quite in these black and white terms in terms of Afghanistan. I'd caution all of us against seeing things that way. I think today is not forever, and a lot remains to be seen about how they're going to govern.
Thank you very much, Jen. Stephen, to you. So what's your take on it? What's the big picture, and what do you think is the impact or will be the impact of situation in developments in Afghanistan on Central Asian security?
Thank you, Nargis. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think that by and large, the Central Asian states are apprehensive about the situation in Afghanistan for reasons that my colleagues have all talked about and we all know going back for years. But they are prepared to accept the Taliban, provided the Taliban can provide effective governance and security inside Afghanistan. Well, now what does that mean? It means no export of terrorism, control of the terrorist groups who are not Taliban, but who are associated with it. Suppression of ISIS-K, for example, maybe with outside help, but still that they cannot make threats to Central Asian states. Substantial reduction, if not elimination, of the drug trade. Although in Tajikistan, to be frank, the government is a narco state, that may not be such a big issue, although they'll never say so for obvious reasons. But otherwise, that's a very serious problem, not only in Central Asia, but in Russia. And of course, control over Islamist and extremist propaganda that would then come into Central Asian states from Afghanistan. Now, to the degree that the Taliban are able to do this, either by themselves or with help, then Central Asian states will be less apprehensive and more inclined to deal with it. Uzbekistan, as my colleagues have said, clearly wants to preserve and extend the infrastructural and trade and transport agreements that it has made. And those go nowhere if Afghanistan remains in chaos. Turkmenistan would like to see the TAPI pipeline somehow eventually materialize. Again, if Afghanistan is a war zone, it won't happen. It hasn't happened up till now. And one major reason is investors will not put money into a project in so uncertain a situation. And you can't work there either. So there are opportunities here, but they depend on the Taliban. And I'm frankly, like most of my colleagues, rather skeptical that given Afghanistan's history, the nature of the Taliban, and what we are already seeing, that they will be able to put together a government that can govern the current Afghan society, which is not the society of Afghanistan in the 1990s. As again, my colleagues here have said, this is not your father's Afghanistan. Even though maybe 500,000 people have fled now, and that may be a high estimate, it's still not going to be a country which wants to go back to the 15th, 16th century in terms of Islam. And if the Taliban are to succeed, they have to realize that. And if they don't realize that or are unable to put government into place, then Central Asian states will be more alarmed than they already are at the situation. Because it's not up to them. The decision is really the Taliban to make. Now, as we have seen, Tajikistan, I suspect with Russian encouragement, went along and said, well, you have to encourage Tajiks to participate in government. There has to be decentralization, etc. I doubt very much that message will be favorably received in Kabul. After all, the Tajiks in the Panjshir Valley are the people who are rebelling. So given the Taliban's orientation and mindset, they're not, and the traditions in Afghanistan, they're not going to try to co-opt them. And the Tajiks are not going to feel secure in a Taliban regime, which is, after all, a Pushtun formation at its core and a Pakistani creation at its core. So you already have the grounds for a civil war there. Now, on the other hand, Kazakhstan is probably the most important actor besides Uzbekistan throughout Central Asia. And they seem to be operating on a parallel track with Uzbekistan. They would like to see Afghanistan calm down. They'd like to see a government. They'd like to see trade. They in Uzbekistan are leading the overall Central Asian movement that is taking place right now to enhance regional cooperation. Perhaps some distant resemblance to ASEAN would be an analogy that people might be able to take about this kind of trend towards regional cooperation, which we just saw in July at the big conference in Tashkent that Uzbekistan sponsored. Now, at the same time, all these states are deeply concerned about the possibility, which is real, of a resurgence of terrorism. as a number of people have written and some of my colleagues have said, there is a danger that the Central Asian states are going to use this situation to enhance the threat perception, which I think most of us believe has been overblown, about a terrorist threat inside each and every Central Asian country coming from Afghanistan and so on. But this possibility of the Taliban failing to control terrorism in their own country will give a kind of credence to it. It will make it more credible a threat assessment and lead to more repression in Central Asia if Afghanistan becomes chaotic. Furthermore, it will lead to a greater dependence on Russia militarily. As it is, Russia is bringing intense pressure to bear on Kazakhstan, on Tajikistan, and on other Uzbekistan to join the Eurasian Economic Council, to allow Russian soldiers into Tajikistan and elsewhere in Central Asia to the bases, in order that Russia can defend them, preserve this role it has in its own mind of the defender of Central Asia, and send the message to Taliban that on the one hand, we want to work with you, but on the other hand, we're not going to tolerate attacks on our neighbors and partners. Now, this does not mean that Russia regards Central Asian states as equal states in terms of their formal independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is not the case. Moscow still does not fully accept that these are truly sovereign, independent states. And I suspect neither does China, as China's already, as we have seen, taken territory from Tajikistan in the past in return for economic dependence. But the possibility of greater instability in Afghanistan, which is a very real one because there's already fighting taking place, is likely to create more incentives and opportunities for both Russia and China to expand their military, as well as perhaps other profiles in Central Asia, and to try to do so together. That's the Russian government is calling the protest. The other incentives beyond that for Russia and China are, of course, that China has enormous investments potentially at stake in the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of Central Asia. And if Afghanistan becomes chaotic, not only do those go into doubt, Pakistan itself might become a target of terrorism. And as we know, China's invested $46 billion in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. So there's an enormous amount of money at stake. On the other hand, if China is convinced that the Taliban are able to bring about order, and potentially with Chinese help, then the possibilities for substantially enhanced Chinese investment in Afghanistan grow by some order of magnitude at that point. So I believe that Russia and China will try to use this opportunity to enhance their position in Central Asia. Now, whether the United States will finally come up with a Central Asian policy that takes account of Central Asia first, rather than the war in Afghanistan driving everything, remains to be seen. It was just announced, as we've been talking, that the US government is going to help build border structures between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Now, does that presage a greater non-military but sustained US involvement? Can't tell, it's too early to say. But it's very clear, therefore, that the fate of the Central Asian government's policies towards the Taliban is really dependent on what the Taliban are able to do or what they are willing to do. And that means, can they govern Afghanistan? And on that question, to quote President Biden, school's out. We have no way of knowing. And if I was an odds maker, I'd give long odds on their success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. One quick question. Do you think Central Asian states need Western security assistance and whether the West would be ready to provide this kind of assistance. And on BRI, it seems that BRI functioned without, much Afghanistan's participation. I don't see why, it's not strictly necessary in a way. So we can suppose that China would try to seal off the kind of Afghanistan. I may make sure that there are no spillovers, but that can work, and the same for Russia. So they don't need a proactive policy there.
Well, first of all, security assistance from the West. If you have a broad definition of security, yes. If it's a question of military personnel beyond training programs that already exist, you're going to run into an enormous amount of Chinese and Russian pressure on them. Now, that does not mean it can't happen, but it means they're going to be very cautious about what they do. And there is really, I don't think, a compelling need for the West to send military people to Central Asia unless the situation gets completely out of hand. But what really is necessary is that there be a substantial upgrading of both EU and American presence in terms of economic investment, healthcare, environmental assistance, which is clearly desperately needed, and economic investment in Central Asia, and support for the sovereignty and integrity of these states, as well as for the developing process of regional cooperation that in time could lead to regional integration. In other words, we need to prevent Russia and China from taking a neo-colonialist policy in Central Asia and strengthening these governments' ability to function as real governments and make their own choices. I don't think that necessitates a large American or European military footprint, but it does, I would say, justify a much greater economic, environmental, and trade footprint throughout Central Asia, all 5 countries. Now, you're absolutely right about the BRI. It's done quite well up till now without Afghanistan. The problems are 2. One, if the Taliban are unable to govern the country, terrorism will then probably spread not only into Central Asia, but very likely into Pakistan. Second, I believe, and I've said this is going to lead to an enhanced Indo-Pakistani rivalry. Because the Taliban are a creature or creation of ISI. I mean, and this is universally admitted and known. Given the really paranoid threat assessments that govern ISI and, for that matter, Pakistan, with regard to what India has been doing in Afghanistan and to India in general, I think this is likely to encourage some elements, both terrorist elements inside India and Pakistan who enjoy ISI support, and maybe even the Pakistani government, to take more probes against India. And of course, that's always a very dangerous situation, because both sides are nuclear and because of the kind of animosity that is so deeply rooted between them, going back 76 years now. So in that respect, that kind of situation would reverberate around Central Asia. And it would also complicate the Chinese efforts to use the port of Gwadar for a lot of the major BRI projects, which are intended to go to Gwadar and then up through the Karakoram Highway into China. The other aspect of the BRI is that if Afghanistan becomes chaotic, it could spill into Central Asia. And then that would really affect BRI projects on the ground, or has the potential to do so. So again, Afghanistan itself is not necessary to the BRI, but the problem is that what happens in Afghanistan is not likely to stay in Afghanistan. And that would cause anxiety to China, plus agitation and propaganda, to use the old Soviet term, in Xinjiang among Uyghurs is a red flag for China.
So many components.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Muhammad, the floor is yours.
Okay, I was expecting you to speak. Terrific. Thank you very much, Nargis. Thank you, Dr. Blank. Thank you, colleagues. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for our audience. We have a large number of audience, and they have a large number of questions, and we have just 15 minutes left to wrap the conversation. And I have a couple of my own questions. I will try to incorporate them with our audience's question. Just going to Salimjon first. You already touched upon this, Salimjon, a little bit about the position that President Rahman is taking these days in terms of the foreign policy with regards to developments in Afghanistan. What was that? The earlier statement that you already mentioned when he was meeting with the Pakistani foreign minister, and that was also very interesting that he made this statement during the meeting with the Pakistani foreign minister. He said, in which he said that unless there's an inclusive government, Tajikistan is not ready to recognize the Taliban administration, the new Afghan administration. That was just one element. And the second thing that you also said, today Rahman has signed an order to award Ahmed Shah Massoud and Burhanuddin Rabbani, both of them are late now, with the highest medal of medal of the nation, at the time when Ahmed Shah Massoud's son is leading the resistance, anti-Taliban resistance force in Panjshir. That was very, very telling from my perspective. And the second thing is, we see a couple of other signs, like you reported, Salimjon, earlier, that there were volunteers signing up to fight along with anti-Taliban resistance forces in Kashmir, in Panjshir, for instance. And then we also see Afghan ambassador in Tajikistan actively leading an anti-Taliban sort of campaign. I don't know how it looks like in diplomatic world, whether these type of things can happen without the passive approval by the host state or not. I'm not sure, but this all is happening at the same time, which clearly tells us where Tajikistan stands in this conflict. But to lead the conversation forward, my question to you is what President Rahman has in mind, especially at the time when the fighting again erupted in Panjshir, and the Panjshiris definitely need outside help to be able to continue their struggle. So as they are surrounded by the Taliban, those Panjshiri groups there, what Rahman is going to do?
Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, Muhammad. Yeah, it's an interesting question. As a journalist, I would like to be inside of the mind of Mr. Rahman to find out what is going on there. It's difficult. However, yeah, it's interesting, a lot of interesting things. But first of all, when we are talking to the political experts in Tajikistan, many of them believe that having in mind the 30 years of history of the anniversary, which is history of Rahman's rule, telling that it's impossible that Rahman is telling all this stuff or doing all those actions without any kind of even smallest agreement with Russia and with some other partners in CIS or in a collective security treaty organization, which he is leading right now, by the way, in terms of a periodical reglement. And sure, I think one of my colleagues told me that, the time, as Jennifer said, we are living in an interesting time. The time brought a kind of gift to Mr. Rahman because it was looking like he is just coming to the end of ruling, end of potentials, end of so all the promises he has been doing every year is finished. Even we can't see any good rotation of cadres in the government and so on. And he is preparing his son to sit on his chair. So, and this situation bring him a kind of opportunity. Also, an opinion of some expert.
Salimjon, we do understand this. President Rahman thinks this is an opportunity, but what he's going to do as the fighting continues in Panjshir? What would be his next step in that?
It could be first of all to engage others, to invite other states, Central Asian and Russia, and maybe China and all others to be on his side. Maybe this will be kind of, but again, looking at his biography, he's a kind of crisis manager. You know, he came to the power on a civil war, outcome. And there was a lot of crisis in the country in 2010, in 2015, and others. So probably he is thinking that it's a good opportunity and a good situation for him. However, it's looking like this time the task is much bigger than maybe he can imagine.
Okay. Well, Omid, can I come to you? Just my second leg of question on the same topic, like how President Rahman's statements are resonated in Afghanistan. Is it making any difference? Is anyone saying anything about it? Omid, your microphone is muted.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, it is actually a big news right now in Afghanistan that what the Tajik government, especially President Rahman, stance is about the Panjshir resistance plus what he awarded to Ahmad Shah Massoud in Burhanuddin Rabbani. Tajikistan has always been considered in Afghanistan as a country where has been helpful and peaceful neighbor, and unlike Pakistan in Iran that has been always accused of fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan and supporting militia groups. The news is currently big, but everybody is also thinking about, well, is only Tajikistan support enough for Ahmad Massoud in his other commanders, including Vice President Amrullah Saleh, in Defense Minister Bismillah Khan, and the rest of the group that used to fight alongside Ahmad Shah Massoud against the Taliban in the 90s. Now the question is the Tajik support enough, and is Tajikistan will Tajikistan be able to or willing to or take the risk of rallying behind the Panjshir resistance, and will it be able to convince other countries to support this cause and this fight? The issue with Panjshir, as we know, is a very small valley, especially if it doesn't have any connection with outside world. At the moment, ideally Tajikistan, people won't survive longer. We remember from the 90s when Ahmad Shah Massoud was fighting there, he had very well support of Tajikistan at that time, and even food and medicine was to a huge extent transported from Tajikistan to Panjshir. And another issue about Panjshir resistance is that lots of people think that this might be a resistance, but will not be able to destabilize a Taliban rule. Might be a fight in parts of Afghanistan, which is basically Baghlan, Panjshir, Takhar, probably, but it will not extend or expand all over the country, just like the Taliban used to do after 2002. We saw the Taliban's movement slowly starting from Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, and then slowly they grew up all over the country. They had other groups that were united with them later on. Obviously, they had huge support by Pakistan and other international terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda, and as former President Ghani was saying, over two dozen Islamist groups are allied with the Taliban fighting in Afghanistan at the time when he spoke about it. I suppose it was about last year, a few months ago. So the Panjshir Valley resistance might not be as strong as it was during Ahmad Shah Massoud for many reasons. First of all, Ahmad Shah Massoud was a different fighter, different character. His son, I guess, lacks that ability because he never grew up in a war, just like Massoud did.
Yeah, totally understandable, Omid, what you are saying. Look, from Tajikistan as well, Central Asian perspective, though, that's a kind of different matter. Also, one more question, I don't know who's going to take this question, is that's also in line with one of our friends are asking on the chat, Melanie Sadouze, the presence of Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan, in northern Afghanistan. Where do they stand as we speak? There are 2-3 distinctive groups in Afghanistan, like ISIS, Taliban, perhaps more. So where they stand today, and politically, closer to Taliban, closer to the ISIS? Jennifer, is it something you would like to take?
Sure. I think there's no one answer to that question because these groups have been so fragmented. And I'd be curious about Omid and Salimjon's perspectives on this as well. But, you know, the IMU was closer to the Taliban, had agreements with the Taliban, especially, you know, with regard to not attacking other countries, but the IMU as an organization fractured over time, right? And so that there were fractures within the leadership of the IMU about, you know, after the death of Mullah Omar and who the leader of the Taliban should be. So some groups, you know, move more towards ISIS. Some Uzbek groups, you know, went in that direction. Others remain closer to the, you know, the Quetta Shura. And then the Tajik groups, I also think that they have been much more aligned, at least over time, with ISIS. But the question is, and the Haqqani network especially, right? I think that's sort of the big element here. And then we see the Haqqani network. So the Haqqani network is part of the government now. But these Central Asian fighters have always been a sort of an appendix of the Haqqani network, or the Haqqanis could use them to have sort of plausible deniability with the Taliban, saying the Taliban, these groups aren't affiliated with the Taliban, but they could be used by the Haqqani network to pursue their own interests. And so I think a big question that we have is, you know, to the degree to which the Taliban control these groups. I don't think that they control them. I think that's probably going to be a priority for them, is to, as all new governments seek to do, is get a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And that's what they're going to be trying to do, is exert control over these groups. But, you know, the Taliban has these groups very conveniently to use as leverage against Tajikistan, for example. So if Tajikistan puts a lot of pressure on Afghanistan and starts supporting Massoud, well, all of a sudden, they also have plausible deniability with groups affiliated with ISIS and the Tajik militants, who they say that don't belong to them. So these are the kinds of games I think we should watch out for in the future, and that's a very dangerous one.
That's very, very interesting. Just Salimjon, you have worked on this project a lot. Is there anything very briefly you would like to add into this? I mean, the other leg of the question by Melanie is also whether they are controlled by the Taliban, whether those Jamaat Ansarullah or others, Central Asians who are there on the ground, are they controlled by the Taliban? Are their actions dictated by any other group except themselves? I mean,
Thank you.
Makes the strategy for them?
Yeah, first I support what Jennifer pointed out, that of course it depends. If we can see that the Taliban probably will move towards more moderation, and those groups will be kind of, it will be difficult to deal with them, and they will move closer to maybe ISK. It should be seen. And the Tajikistan's position and what Mr. Rahman is doing now probably will give whoever control those groups to use them against border, against Tajikistan, inside of the country, and so on. However, if they are listening or obeying Taliban, I can bring just one point, that after our report, we heard that because we talked to Taliban spokesman also, if he confirmed or deny the presence of Jamaat Ansarullah in the Afghan-Tajik border, and if it's true that they given control of 5 districts belong alongside of the border. And the Taliban spokesman told us that it's not true, and they will investigate the situation and so on. But we heard that Ansarullah received a command from Taliban that to keep a lower profile for the time being, and not to make any noise against the Tajik side of the border, because in some places the border is just a small river. You know, it's easier to open fire or to make any kind of provocation. And since this command, so we are witnessing calmness, a full calmness at the border. And even those people among our sources are afraid to talk to us about the situation or giving us any information. And yes, so it's looking like they are listening to Taliban, at least for the time being.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess, Nergis, we are out of time. We have time for one question to Dr. Blank. And if Dr. Blank, you can briefly, very briefly answer. And another friend is asking, how do the panelists, speakers, in this case, Dr. Blank, you, Russia and China's engagement with Central Asia, Central Asian states on security matters to change after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I think it will grow because both states have more direct interest now in the area, with the West being ejected, and that's the right word, from Afghanistan.
Can Dr. Blank, in 5 bullet points, in which way it's going to grow?
Okay. 1, security cooperation. 2, anti-terrorist cooperation. 3, support for enhanced military presence of Russia, and maybe possibly even increased Chinese military presence. 4, if the Taliban can govern effectively, China will expand its economic profile in Central Asia. And 5, cooperation to suppress reform in Central Asia and keep Washington and the EU to a greater, lesser degree out of Central Asia.
Okay, well, fascinating. I also had another kind of bullet point to ask about this sort of a confusing picture that we are getting from Uzbekistan, like the yesterday's news from Uzbekistan, as per the Wall Street Journal, is that they finally saying that there are 585 Afghans in Uzbekistan, and they are asking US to take them out. And this is the same statement which Uzbek authorities have made initially, and then they denied it. So there has been kind of mixed picture coming out of Uzbekistan. Perhaps to not extend the conversation, I'm going to keep this question to some other format, some other panel, some other discussion. So with this, Nergis, back to you. And from my end, thank you very much, colleagues, for this fascinating conversation. And thank you very much for audience for speaking with us, although we are a little bit over time today.
Thank you very much, Muhammad. Yes, unfortunately, we've run out of time. But the good thing is that we will continue the discussion on the 30th of September. So the same group, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Oxford Society, and the Davis Center are holding a discussion on the Taliban takeover in Central Asian security. What will Russia and China do? So we can actually focus on that. And we will have an Uzbek expert, and we can ask him these questions, and maybe there will be more clarity at this point. So let me thank our wonderful speakers today. I think we've covered a lot of ground, jointly answered many questions, but we raised new ones. And let me thank the audience that joined us today, and my co-organizers, my co-moderator, and the Davis Center events team who helped us actually make this a reality. Thank you very much.